Du kigger på Videorackham. Forfatteren Chris Claremont har skrevet Marvels superhelteserie X-Men siden 1975, og hans længste sammenhængende periode har løbet frem til 1991, og herefter har det været mere on and off. Han er derfor en af Marvel-universets hovedarkitekter, og nogen vil sige blandt de 5 mest betydningsfulde forfattere i forlagets historie. X-Men-universet blev etableret i 1963 af Jack Kirby og Stan Lee, men det var Claremont og hans mange kunstneriske samarbejdspartnere, der gjorde X-Men til en helt central del af Marvels udgivelser. Siden er serien blevet filmatiseret, og X-Men har været med til at starte den bølge af superheltefilm, der de seneste år er blevet et populært kulturelt fænomen. Alt dette ville have været umuligt uden Chris Claremonts toneangivende run på tegneserien. Chris Claremont besøgte efterårets Bogforum Comics og blev efterfølgende interviewet af Rackhamit Henry Sørensen og Matthias Wivel. Det blev til et dybdegående interview om hans liv med serien, og du kan blandt andet høre hans tanker om de nye X-Mens oprindelse i 1975, om de klassiske historier The Dark Phoenix Saga, Days of Future Past og Life Death, og så fortæller han også om sit samarbejde med tegnere som John Byrne, Frank Miller, Bill og Barry Windsor-Smith, og om hvorledes andre kræfter på Marvel med tiden undergravede hans vision for X-Men. Og så er der jo masser af guf til de inkarnerede fans. Du kan høre hans tanker om Phoenix endeligt, om hvorfor hendes alter ego, Jean Grey sammen med Wolverine, udgør X-Men-universets guder, og du kan høre om, hvordan den uafsluttede Life Death-trilogi skulle have været afsluttet. Og så får du selvfølgelig også at vide, hvem Nightcrawlers og Wolverines virkelige forældre er, og om hvordan Claremont ville have afsluttet hele X-Men-sagaen, den saga, som han beskriver som en stor, episk historie, hvis han da havde haft en kreativ kontrol over serien. Og så er der også lidt til husarerne, når vi spørger ind til de bondage- og sadomasochistiske motiver og seksuelle undertoner, som hans arbejde også præges af. Så sæt dig godt til rette, find popcornene frem og glæd dig til de næste godt 2 timer i selskab med Chris Claremont og Rachamit Henry Sørensen og Matthias Wivel.
So if we start at the beginning, I mean at the beginning of the X-Men, I think we'll just focus on that.
Yeah. Okay.
So not your career before that, but like the beginning of the X-Men.
What you did was basically you were handed a book that was on the brink of cancellation, and I think actually it was cancelled, right? And then
no, okay.
And then
this will take 5 minutes. The original X-Men that Stan and Jack created,
yes,
ran a little over, I believe, 60 issues.
Yes. 66.
Stan and Jack did the first dozen or so, and then it just got handed off to various writers and officers or artists subsequently. Hitting its golden age, I guess one might say, when Roy Thomas and Neil Adams took over in the low 50s and did about 9, maybe 11 issues. This is in 1960, the end of 68, beginning of 69,
yes,
which coincided with my arrival at Marvel as a gopher, which is what they called interns then.
Yeah.
Because the actual term meant this was the kid you said, go for coffee, go for this, go for pencils, go for that. You know, my official title was to do as I was told, whatever it was. And that's where I made a contribution to Roy and Neil's arc, which basically got rid of the Sentinels in that original story. Fly into the sun.
Yeah.
Which was a brilliant piece of art by Neil.
Very memorable.
Thank you. So then, officially, I came back in as a freelancer in 19.
But hang on, that sequence, just for our listeners, it's the Sentinels are convinced to fight the sun, and therefore they're these mutant hunting robots.
No, I mean the Sentinels' existence is defined by their core programming, which is get rid of all mutants.
Yeah,
destroy all mutants.
That's right.
But tragically, everyone forgets that if you are writing a program, you have to frame it in as specific a term as possible. If you just say get rid of all mutants, technically speaking, mutants are an inherent aspect of all human DNA. So eventually you could expand that reality to expunge the human race, because we are an ongoing mutation. Each new birth is vaguely mutated from the genes are slightly twisted from, in a positive way, hopefully, from the genes of the parents, of the grandparents, etc., etc. Or at least that could be the way it might be interpreted in storytelling. What I pitched was that since the Sentinels at that point in the story had wiped out every attempt by the X-Men to defeat them, the X-Men had basically lost. How do you overcome that? And Scott had a flash of inspiration, which is mutation is caused by solar radiation. So if you want to technically get rid of mutants, one has to get rid of the sun. Yeah. So Neil drew this brilliant page of the Sentinels pouring into the sun.
And you suggested this to Roy or to Neil, or how did that work?
To Roy. Because I was, at that time, I was working as a gopher. As I said, this is my first experience at Marvel. Neil, Roy, everyone were just standing around the office trying to figure out what to do next. And I kind of raised my hand and said, well, this is what is theorized. Does that help?
So that was basically your first job on the X-Men.
My first contribution to it, yes.
Contribution, yeah.
So I go way, 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 way back.
Yes, you do, sir.
But then again,
yeah.
So cut ahead to 1975, when Stan had decided, let's try again with the X-Men, but this time, rather than have 4 white guys and a white girl, we want to try for a more international focus, a more international audience. We'll try and market the series overseas and see if that helps. So this is where Dave Cockrum came.
Roy was thinking of the Blackhawks, is my understanding.
Okay.
Which was also this international team, Golden Age.
Yeah, fine with me. I was outside of that initial conference between. I mean, it was a collective group of Roy, Stan, Len Wein, Dave Cockrum. The idea was to pull characters from all over, which, because of Dave's ridiculously wonderful creative ability, half of them were characters he'd pitched to the Legion of Superheroes and been rejected. So he'd modified them and
over in DC at DC.
Yeah, DC's Legion of Superheroes,
yeah.
which was fine by me, because the designs that he actually came up with for the Legion were kind of appropriate to the Legion, which meant boring as can be. Whereas once he reworked them, Aurora evolved into the woman she became in the X-Men. Nightcrawler was there, Colossus was there, Thunderbolt was there. The only existing new character to come and stay with the book was Wolverine, which I believe Roy had helped create a few months earlier, that Len had introduced in the Hulk.
The Hulk,
with Herb Trimpe drawing it. John Romita had a significant role, as I recall, in designing him.
I think he designed the costume, yeah.
But I've heard Dave Cockrum also said that he had a proto character called Wolverine that he'd shown to Roy, so he might also.
There you go.
One could believe it, like, guy coming up with characters.
Well, no, Dave. It was, you think of it, you come up with it. ridiculous as it sounds, I was pretty much the same way. If I need a new character, it miraculously or otherwise, it ideally pops into my head. It's, I guess the way I think of it is, if John Byrne had gotten his wish when he went to Jim Shooter and said, Chris goes or I go, and Jim had said, okay, bye, Chris. John can have the X-Men. Maybe you can have the FF. All the characters that I created subsequently, which were pretty much all of my characters, for example, Rogue, Mystique, Destiny, and Sabretooth had all been created either for Iron Fist or Ms. Marvel.
Yeah, which you've done concurrently or just before starting the X, but concurrently, right at the beginning.
Iron Fist was.
Well, I was writing my hands off, so to speak. So I was, again, we were just starting the X-Men. A lot of, for example, Ms. Marvel predated the X-Men. So I created them for that book. And Mystique and Destiny and Rogue were introduced actually in Avengers Annual that Michael Golden and I did.
Yeah.
And they looked brilliant.
How did you end up getting put on the book? Because Len Wein wrote that
the X-Men?
the introduction, the X-Men, the giant size
because
X-Men. Was he
what happened was that it was given to Len, and Len and Dave started working on. It was originally pitched as a quarterly because no one wanted to really take. Management wanted to take as little a risk as possible. So doing it as a quarterly, it gave time to work. It gave time to see how it was dealt with by the audience. There wasn't a lot of pressure, or there was much less pressure on it than there would have been on a bi-monthly or a monthly title, both in terms of production and in terms of expectation. So it was thought to be a more comfortable way of introducing things. And so Giant Size #1 was coming together. And at that time, Len was editor-in-chief and I was associate editor, which meant he had the office with the door and I had the desk right outside the door. And between the two of us, we were running the color comics. Yeah. Which sounds incredibly pretentious at this, after the better part of 60 years, but that was the way it was. But for me, just watching Dave create these characters, I ended up sneaking into Len's office as often as I could just to listen to them talk and to see what was being produced, which of course used to make Len very annoyed because why was I sitting in his office when I should be outside at my desk doing what I was told, like getting the books out. So they got to the end of the story and great, we have like 13 X-Men, we have one Madcap Island. How do we win? How do we defeat Krakoa? And again, words just popped out of my mouth and I said, well, what is an island? It's just the top of a mountain that sticks out above the waterline. Why not just slice through the mountain below the waterline and let the rotation of the Earth around its axis and the revolution of the Earth around the sun, or have I got it backwards? Anyway, those two rings do the rest. So the Earth keeps moving through space and Krakoa stays where it is, which means it's in fairly short order, it rises out of the atmosphere, out of Earth's gravity well. And now, surprise, you have nothing more than the top of an island, which is now the latest asteroid to join the solar system. And if you wanted to get even more annoying, you could just have the rocks fall apart in process, which was both a simple and efficient way of getting rid of this stupid thing.
And so you suggested this. Was this before you got assigned?
Oh no,
job?
this is before. This is when it was Len's book.
Yeah.
So I gave him the idea, and also it was a way to me that all 13 X-Men could contribute to the defeat, or as many as possible.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. Dave drew this brilliant sequence of panels, and Krakoa went bye-bye. I thought forever. Foolish me.
Nothing's forever.
And that was that.
Yeah.
So soon after that, Len decided that he'd had enough of being editor-in-chief and he wanted to go be a writer again, a full-time writer. And his exit deal was to get 4 top-of-the-line monthly series, the Hulk and I think Spider-Man and a couple of others, for himself. But at the same time, Marvel decided a quarterly was inefficient. It didn't earn quite enough money to justify the time and expense of production. So they would step back and shift it into the regular run as a bi-monthly. So it would come out 6 issues a year. The problem with that was Len felt he could not handle, that was 1/2 a book too many. So,
Go on.
sorry?
Yeah. Please go on.
So he had to give up the title. And the moment I heard this, I went in, and the way I tell the story is I tackled him and said, I want this book. And it was probably a little more restrained than that, but Len said yes. I wanted it because they were really cool characters. Dave was a wonder to work with. But most important of all, it was the first time in 15 years, I guess, that a brand new concept, a brand new clutch of characters, a brand new series had come into being. If I'd gone on to Spider-Man, well, Stan and Steve Ditko had defined that one. If I went on to the FF, Stan and Jack had done that for 100 issues. What could I do that they couldn't do better? The same with Thor, the same with the Avengers. Everything else, you were picking up concepts and characters that were well established. With the X-Men, the new X-Men, suddenly everything was brand new.
Yeah,
and from a writer's perspective, that's just like, whoa, let's see what I can get away with here.
There's definitely a freshness to the new team of the X-Men, but we were just talking about before the interview began, how much did you, in your initial work, pull from Stan and Jack in your work on the X-Men?
What do you mean?
Did you take anything from their short-lived run on the X-Men?
There wasn't really much to take other than the Sentinels.
Oh, no.
So if I may suggest one thing that I see is in the lineage of Stan's way of writing, which is very characteristic, and you might disagree, but the way that Stan, like the soap opera aspect that he so successfully introduced into superheroes, or at least made very popular, is something that you did with great success, I thought. You might disagree.
Well,
and also this way that that the characters externalize they externalize their emotions. So you get a lot. There's a lot of attempts at psychological realism in Stan's work that I think you developed much further.
Well, I think you have to understand the realities. I mean, Stan, in addition to writing everything, at least in the first 2 or 3 or 4 years, was also editor-in-chief of the company, doing his very best to keep Marvel afloat. I mean, at the time in the early 60s, where you had DC series like Action Comics and whatever that were selling 1 million copies an issue, yes, that was very impressive until you realized that a year later they were selling a fraction of 1 million. It was a downward strike all along, a descending curve all along. And we were all trying desperately to find a way to reverse that, to go up. the thing about Roy and Neil was that the art, the stories were wonderful. No one knew what the sales were until 7 months later. The first issues, for example, might come out in November of 68. We wouldn't know what the sales were until the end of summer 69. So by the time Marvel knew that they had a hit on their hands with Roy and Neil, the book had been canceled and Neil had gone back to DC. So there was no way to exploit it. It might have been a little bit more efficient 5 years later when I came aboard, or 7 years later when I took over the X-Men, but not all that much. The expectation within the industry was that it was a death spiral. That we would come back in 10 years, comics as we understood them, as we knew them, as we loved them, wouldn't exist anymore. We would be gone. So, it's whereas, again, all the other major Marvel titles, the Avengers, Spider-Man, the FF, had an established reality that you could play with. My responsibility then, right off the bat, was to establish the reality. Who are they? I mean, I vaguely knew, okay, Aurora's from Africa. This is her history. Nightcrawler's from Germany, that apparently hadn't advanced at all since
the Middle Ages.
Well, I was going to say since I guess one could say Frankenstein.
Yeah, Frankenstein. Fair enough.
Although Peter Rasputin was from Russia, which I suppose young Russians would feel was a very recognizable place now, as then. Might have been different 10 years ago, but that's a whole different discussion. Yeah. Thunderbird was from the American West. So they were interesting, but unexpectedly different characters to play with. But the most seminal reality, aside from the fact they were different colors, is that the original 5 X-Men were kids. They were high school students, maybe baby college students in terms of age. So it made sense to have them at a school for gifted youngsters, because that's what they were. Whereas the new X-Men were the antithesis of that. Okay, Colossus figured 19, 20. That's good. Kurt, a little older, 20, 21. Thunderbird, I was playing, because of when the book came out, with the trope that he was a survivor of the Vietnam War. That meant he was in his mid-20s, possibly late 20s. Wolverine, Len had intended as a kid. Not only as a kid, but that the claws were part of his gloves. That's why they had the big, bulbs between his fingers. That's where the claws were housed, and they somehow expanded magically out to full extension. The problem, I think, that both Dave Cockrum and I had with that was, what does that make? How does that differentiate Wolverine in the slightest from Iron Man? All you do is steal the armor and bingo, you're Iron Man. Or Rhodey turns into whatever. War Machine. There's a good peaceful name. And 90s. His mutant power was the power to heal. Well, speaking purely as a writer in that era, healing is boring. Okay, you punch him out, he goes to bed and wakes up 5 minutes later and he's back to normal. That's nice, but it's not exactly visual. Until, I think, after we'd been working on the book for about a little less than 2 months. Dave walks in one day, and on the back of the page, which what would happen is he'd draw a page, and then on the back he would doodle. And one of these doodles was him coming in with a fist, and coming out of the back of the fist were the 3 claws. And I remember taking a look at it and thinking, that is the most disgusting thing I'd ever seen. That is so cool.
Yeah.
Because suddenly, with the claws being a part of him, he was not only a mutant, but he was creepy and more than a little scary. Because what kind of idiot has adamantium claws coming out of his body? And of course, the next question is, how did they get into his body in the first place? So the other aspect was that even though Len had thought of him as a kid, the way Dave drew him from the first moment he appeared in Giant Size #1 was as someone significantly older.
Yeah.
Now, significantly older could be 50, but my impulse was, if he's got a healing factor, what would be the best thing for a healing factor to deal with but age? So we don't really know how old Wolverine is. They say, okay, he's from Canada. Okay, that if he's from Canada and he's vaguely Caucasian, that gives you a 400 plus window to deal with.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, he came over with the Vikings. Now you're talking way back.
Yeah.
But as I said, it expanded his frame of operation. So, and then with Aurora, I just decided out of pure arrogance, I would give her birthday my birthday, because the seminal moment of her life is when she's orphaned in Cairo during the Arab-Israeli War of 1954. Not the Arab-Israeli, the French, Anglo-Israeli, Egyptian War in the mid-50s. So the idea then was, what the hell? I'll give her an age of 50, my age, which was 25, which didn't seem that much older, except that time marches on, except in comic books. And here we are in the 21st century, and she's still, if you follow that paradigm, she's a whole lot older.
Yeah.
Much like the Scarlet Witch, but that's a whole different story. But the idea was to instill this new version of the X-Men with far more variety. But as a consequence, you're dealing with at least 2, possibly 3 characters who are very much experienced with the use of their powers. And the only real thing they have to learn is how to work together as a team, which makes them seminally different from the original X-Men, which down the road led to moments where Scott has to go up to Charles and say, you've got to step back a little, sir. You can't give Wolverine demerits. It doesn't work that way with him. Same with Aurora, but Aurora at least is a grown-up. She won't lose her temper. Wolverine will. But again, that sort of moment is to demonstrate how Scott is a leader who can adapt to different situations and cope. Charlie, not so much, ironically. So we started going in different directions. And because, the challenge with comic books is you have 100 pages, 100 panels over 17 to 20 pages to tell your story. The tools you have to do it with are the visuals, the dialogue balloons, the thought balloons, and the captions. And then you have to figure out which is which applies to which. People have criticized my X-Men because someone will think obvious things. I am so-and-so. I am from here. I am from there. My ability is to manipulate the weather. Yes, that's true, because as Stan hammered into us from the very beginning, each issue is somebody's first issue, and they have to know who everybody is and what everybody can do as quickly and efficiently as possible. Otherwise, they'll be sitting there staring at the page and wondering, what the dickens is this?
I think what it also gives, I think, which was, I think, new for people reading superhero comics, is that because of how much you explained in the text, it's of course to get people up to speed, but also in terms of their emotions, what they're thinking about, their situation, their relations to others. I think readers realized you really thought about this. You know, it's a way of foregrounding that a lot of thought has gone into these characters and their relationships and what they're feeling in this particular instance.
That's my job.
Yeah. But it foregrounds it that you're actually explicating a fair amount of it in the text, rather than it's just suggested in the drawing.
I mean, that's a reality faced by every writer, and a way of dealing with it that changes with every writer. I can probably present you with Steve Englehart's stories that are far more intricate. Star-Lord, far more intricate, far more well thought out, deeply thought out than mine. Alan Moore. The same. Everybody has their own way of approaching the reality, and the reality evolves over time. I can get away with things, for example, with Wolverine today, that would have been far more challenging in 1975, simply because he was a brand new character then. No one would really know quite what he was capable of doing. But again, that said, here's Colossus. He's 18, 19 years old, but most importantly, he's from a shtetl, not a shtetl, a communal farm in southwest Russia. He's a communist. He's been raised as a communist. This is a reality of his life. Here he is now working for Russia's greatest adversary, the United States. How does that play with him? How does he's never been away from home. He's a kid who by rights should be home helping with the farm. Now he's saving the universe. How does that affect him? How does the fact that he hasn't seen his parents in X amount of time affect him?
Yeah, the fact that he has a family back home.
Sorry?
That he has a family back home. And
Yeah,
a sister,
exactly.
Right?
Kurt,
yeah.
Here's Kurt, spent most of his life, almost all of his life in a circus. What's it like being in again, 30 miles outside of New York City? What's it like having his best friend be Logan?
Right, and it's
everybody.
It's that you're asking these questions of the characters. I think
that's my job. I'm a writer.
Yeah. But
Aurora has spent maybe the last third of her life living on top of Kilimanjaro in Kenya, using her powers to help sustain the land around her and the people as well. But then again, over time, the next question would become, what about the rest of Africa? What about the Sahara? How can you not use your powers to deal with that? Well, that's establishing she has limitations. Or if she spends time and power helping one portion of the planet, she has to get all that base material, weather material, from somewhere else. What happens there? If she saves Africa at the cost of Brazil, what are the consequences there?
Yeah.
It's trying to balance the ecological realities of A versus the necessity of B.
Sure.
But for me, that's fun.
Yeah. Really important, of course, it becomes central to your run in the early years. Also, when John Byrne comes on, is the development of two of the old characters, especially Jean Grey, but also Scott Summers, the Cyclops, who stays on, and their romance, and of course Jean's transformation into Phoenix, which is something
that was Dave and me right from the beginning, though.
Yeah. And
I mean, we had to do, the instruction was to do something spectacular for issue 100. The reaction was, the book's only 7 issues old. What the hell are you talking about? Well, it's the 100th issue. We have to do something really cool. And I suppose the revelation for us is that when she leaves the book in issue 95, she looks like the most boring, conservative, upper middle class character imaginable. I mean, boring clothes, boring. She's wearing a hat, for God's sakes. She would look appropriate sitting at a royal occasion in London, but not much else. So that Dave and I took a breath, and when we brought her back in issue, I believe 96, when Havoc and Polaris turn quote unquote evil, suddenly she walks in the height of mid-70s fashion, wearing mini shorts and looking cool. And that's where we wanted her to go from there, because if she's Jean and she's a redhead, somebody on this team has to look cool. And she was it.
Yeah.
And then one step led to another. And who are we going to... I mean, my instinct even then was, why is it Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, and yet it's Batgirl, Supergirl, Spider-Girl, Marvel Girl? They're all girls. Why? Because they're more cute that way. Well, that wasn't the way I saw women, isn't the way I see women now. So I wanted to basically pop everybody's eyeballs, have their eyes go wide with, holy cow, what are we doing? And that was Phoenix. Yeah. And the next few issues leading up into John's run were a case of Scott suddenly realizing, especially after 108, that his girlfriend, who he always thinks of as Marvel Girl, just saved the Omniverse all by herself.
Yeah. She saves everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Which in turn sets off the path to her own destruction, because she is basically jumping into a level of evolution that by rights she wouldn't encounter otherwise for another billion years. So she's way ahead of her curve and has not evolved the physical, emotional responsibility to enable her to deal with it. Partly that's why she and Storm are so become best friends, because they face the same challenges, but on a significantly different level. Yeah.
So with Dave, you did the Macron Crystal story where she saves the universe, and I think that you said that's where the beginnings of this, like this narrative arc of her, like her enormous power. So John Byrne comes on board, and what is his contribution to that part, and how was that? How did that compare to
that story? The problem was that the story I wrote was for Dave, and Dave the deadline just ate him up. I mean, that's why we had the fill-in for 105, perhaps.
It's later on, I think.
No, there's one fill-in before, there's one fill-in after, because Dave, he had 4 months to do issue 108 or 7, the first part of the arc, and no time to do 8, which is why we pulled John in, and that was basically that. Which is heartbreaking for me because I thought Dave was just wonderful. And I would have loved to have seen how he would have ended the story visually. But that was basically it. Jean kicked herself up to a level higher than anybody else in the Marvel universe and saved everything. And then, and that, in a sense, was a flashback to what was happening in 100, where the first people she saves are everybody else on the space shuttle and then herself.
Yeah.
But the way she saves herself is by bonding with one of the primal forces of creation, which even in my evolving perception of her reality is what should always have happened. It was stretching the game back then.
Right.
Can I just briefly ask you before we go into John Byrne's run, how did Mr. Cockrum and you work together? Was it a sort of like a back and forth with the so-called Marvel method where you pitched an idea and yeah. So Cockrum more or less plotted everything in pictures, and then
we bounced ideas back and forth. I laid out the direction the story went in, and gave him the plot, and it was up to him from there on.
All right.
A written plot, like a summary, a synopsis, or
and then you wrote the dialogue and everything afterwards. All right.
Yeah. I mean, bear in mind, this is, Stan used to sit in his office with Jack Kirby, and they'd just bounce ideas back and forth, or Jack would come in and say, "I've got this idea," and Stan would go, "Okay, great."
Yeah.
The thing that made Stan essential is that he knew what to cut, which the rest of us all learned the old-fashioned way when Jack went over to DC and did New Gods. Because Jack's had so many ideas and so many brilliant ideas. I guess the way I tell it now is I read the first issue of New Gods and it was like, wow, there are like a dozen brilliant ideas here. And I can't wait for the next issue to see what happens next. Well, what happened next was he came up with a dozen more ideas that piled on top of the dozen that already existed. And the third issue did the same thing, and the fourth. So that's why DC, by the time they got to issue 9, I think, they didn't even get to a dozen. Just, they couldn't deal with it anymore, and they tried to pull Jack back a couple of steps, and that's when Jack quit and went back to Marvel. The problem was not Jack having ideas. The problem was choosing which idea would make for a brilliant issue of the FF and which could wait till the next issue or the next issue or the next issue. And Jack felt that Stan was imposing, was just, "Why aren't you letting me do what I want?" And Stan was saying, "Because I want the book to make sense." And with me and Dave, it's an idea of which is the stuff we want to focus on and which is the stuff we want to let bounce up against the wall and say, "Don't lose track of this, kids. We'll be back to it later." John is a much more linear and specific craftsman. He knew where he wanted to go and how he wanted to get there. I did too. Occasionally we'd weave together positively, and occasionally we'd ram into each other. And
he has more aspirations at this point to be a writer himself, doesn't he? I mean,
I'm sorry?
John Byrne has more, like, even when you're working together, he has more aspirations to write his own stories. He went on to,
that's a question you'll have to ask John.
Yeah, it
My
seems
point,
that way.
we were a team, but the problem with many teams is there's a point where somebody has to step back and let the other person's story choices take precedence. And it got to the point where neither of us was willing to do that anymore. Because I liked my ideas. He liked his ideas. I knew mine were right. He knew his were right. And
Shooter had made a decision at the end.
Yeah, but any editor-in-chief would have had to make that decision.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the creative reality.
Yeah.
That's a fact of life in this business.
But it was a run that established a lot of the core concepts of the X-Men going forward. Dark Phoenix, Days of Future Past, Wolverine, the further development of Wolverine.
Yeah, well, because Dave's favorite character was Nightcrawler. Yeah. John didn't really like Nightcrawler all that much.
He liked the Canadian
character was the Canadian Wolverine, as John was Canadian. The interesting thing is that John, because we had to see if John could actually draw the X-Men, we did the last issue, I think, of Iron Fist, where it's a team up between Iron Fist and the X-Men, and to see how well he could draw the characters. And it's the first time we get to see Wolverine without his. Oh no, it's not the first. Yeah, it might have been the first time we get to see Wolverine without his hat, his cowl. Which, depending on what the angle is, looks an awful lot like Batman's, but we won't go into that. And John drew him as a perfectly normal, ordinary Canadian with a short-haired buzz cut. And Dave is the one who had the hair bouncing up into the...
Right.
Explaining why he wears that silly hat. That's the way his hair goes.
Doesn't want to mess with hair too much.
Yeah, I mean, but Dave's was far more interesting in terms of a character than John's was, so we went with it. But that's how things work. You go with, one goes with one's gut reaction to a visual, and either it works or doesn't.
To return to the Jean Grey and the development of Dark Phoenix,
the
expression of her irrational dark side, how you want to describe it. How did that develop? I mean, it seems, of course, in retrospect, like a natural development in terms.
But that's how it developed.
Right.
We were taking the interesting thing. If I were doing a what if, the what if I would like to play with and it would be longer than a 4-issue miniseries from my perspective, would be, what if Mastermind had been run over by a truck? What would have happened if she'd never encountered Mastermind, if she had evolved positively and naturally, surrounded by the man she loves, her best friend, her other friends in the X-Men? What if, in a way, Charlie became the adversary for trying to keep the power under control, whereas her friends were trying to instinctively help her mature as a young woman to the point where she could handle that, where she could save the universe and move on, where she could become Phoenix as Phoenix is meant to be. And when she confronted Dark Phoenix, confronted herself, confront the negative side of her, and perhaps triumph.
Right.
And then what? Because the thing I always loved playing with, at least in my own head, was what is it that attracts her to Logan? What is it that attracts Logan to her? Well, because Logan exemplifies the same conflict within himself that she does within her. Phoenix, Dark Phoenix, Logan the man, Logan the man versus Wolverine the Beast. And that's what led me to my eventual realization that the way it goes is that the Omniverse comes to an end, and then Jean and Logan finally get their happy ending. And that, because Phoenix is the source of life and Logan is the catalyst that brings it, that lights the fire, that's what starts it all over again. So that the heartbreak is that Scott and Madeline, even though the passion they feel for Scott and Jean, Madeline and Logan, the passion they feel for one another is absolutely legitimate. They only last 150 years at best. After a billion years, who knows anymore? Jean and Logan are essentially, though they'll deny it passionately, they're essentially the X-Men's equivalent of gods. And they're there. They have a specific reason for being there, but they play on a wholly different plane than the rest of the team. And it would have been fun, at least from my perception, to play with that.
Right. Maybe is there still a possibility at some point?
The sun rises every morning. You never know.
Yeah. But in terms of this, and this is where I may slightly embarrass you again, just like last time we spoke. I mean, there's a distinct sexual undertone to or erotic undertone to this. There's emotional manipulation by Mastermind of Dark Phoenix. Yeah, Dark Phoenix, and old interview with you when in the X-Men Companion I have here, you describe it as in those terms, like that it's a sexual, almost orgasmic experience when she destroys this sun.
Yeah.
Well, there is this undertone.
No. It's not necessarily that it's orgasmic. The point is she's just basically sprinted from Earth to the edge of Shi'ar space, which is three galaxies away. That's a long schlep. I mean, that's like sprinting, I guess, a marathon. So she gets to the other end and she's hungry. She's starved. Oh, look, there's a star. I'll grab it, and she grabbed it to eat. Never occurred to her to look at the planets around it. If it had, she might have said, oh, I'll find a different star. But bear in mind, the same thing happened in FF 49 when Galactus came to Earth and the Watcher said, this is a living planet. So I'm Galactus.
Yeah.
I need food. They're on their own. They're so far beneath me on the evolutionary scale. I don't care about them.
But still,
Phoenix, at that point, the living beings on Debari were the equivalent of dust beneath her feet. She had no acknowledgement no instinctive acknowledgement of them because her needs mattered far more to her than their lives. That's, when you are on that level of evolution, that's the way it is. The only reason she destroyed the Shi'ar battle cruiser is it got in her way and attacked. And from her perspective is, hey, dude, this is your fault. You shot at me. I didn't shoot at you.
But still, you introduced the so-called Hellfire Club, which is sort of like a cross between Rotary and a swingers club. How the hell did you get that past the editorial board in the late 70s in what was basically considered a children's book.
We weren't considered a children's book. We were considered an all ages book.
Okay.
Nothing ever occurred on panel that was rude or inappropriate.
No.
The costumes were a little
risque.
Well, actually, John's presentation of them, not so much. Even the corsets and it was a very respectable bikini, let's put it that way. Later artists might have gone a little more extreme.
Oh, indeed.
But that was, by that point, we were in the 80s, which was, everything was getting a little more extreme.
But there are these themes of domination and submission, and there are a lot of people getting tied up.
Wait, and you're going to tell me that never happens in Batman? You're going to tell me that?
No, I mean, I'm just. What
Joker is not about domination. He just tells jokes.
Like Marston's Wonder Woman is full of it. You know, like but it's these subliminal aspects to genre comics that I think that give them personality and give them some substance beyond.
Life is a matter of domination. Life is a matter of a school teacher telling a young kid, you're getting detention. What did I do? Well, you spoke in class, so you have to stay behind. Probably where this all comes from is when I was 8, in an early grade, we were supposed to we label the parts of I think it was a rooster. Okay, here's the nose, the tail, the wings, the feet, but it was a rooster. So I did a word balloon of cock-a-doodle-doo. It seemed like the most natural thing. I got detention. The teacher called my mother. My mother came in, and the teacher said, "Look what your son did." And my mother laughed. She thought it was very funny. And the teacher said, "Well, with a mother like you, it's no wonder Christopher's turning out the way he is." And my mother's reaction was like, inappropriate word, you, subtext being, "I'm sorry, I was bombed by the Nazis when I was in the Royal Air Force. What the hell are you talking about? What did you ever do?" And that's just me writing dialogue in. But all things are a matter of finding a balance between who's on top and who isn't, who's the aggressor, who's the defender, who wins, who loses. One could make the same argument about political elections here, war in Europe and the Middle East. This is all a matter of challenge, triumph, loss. In comics and superhero confrontations, it's just labeled in much more specific and simplistic terms.
Right.
So
but it allows you to explore these themes. I mean, I think one scene which is very, where you tied in with love and affection is the scene with Scott and Gina on the top of the butte in Monument Valley.
My God, she's taken my glasses off and nothing's happened.
Yeah.
No,
it's class, which otherwise would destroy her, but she is so powerful that she can just stop them.
Right, and she doesn't even think twice about it. It's also back at the mansion when Jean's explaining what's happened to her parents, and Scott's just sitting there brooding, and Kurt comes in and it's like, "Oh, I understand. You feel embarrassed because your girlfriend is now much stronger than you. I can see that's a problem. Me, I know nothing about such things. I've only been blue and furry since I was born."
Yeah.
With a tail. I mean, this is, how does one try to explain prejudice and fear and anger to someone who's isn't used to thinking in those terms. I mean, Scott's always thought of himself as a hero. Yet here he is reacting to Jean as perhaps what's his face who created the Sentinels reacted to Scott.
Yeah.
And this is why, in a fundamental way, changing the ending of 137 was the smart move. And I'd love to say I wish I'd thought of it, but I didn't, because we never considered being allowed to go in that direction. We thought we had to come to an end and reboot her. We had to give her an escape clause.
That because not all our listeners might be. I mean, it's a story you've told a million times, I know, but what happened and what were you intending to do?
Well, what was going to happen was the Shi'ar strip her of her superpowers, of her Phoenix powers, and John felt a substantial portion of her brain, so she'd come back a little dumber than she left, or a little simpler, I should say, would probably be a more appropriate phrase. And she and Scott would live happily ever after, which anyone with half a brain would know is totally unfounded, because it would only be a matter of time before the Phoenix reasserted itself.
Yeah.
And we would have to go through this all over again.
And the Phoenix, the Untold Story, published this original ending that you actually drawn out.
Jim felt, again, legitimately, that you cannot kill 5 million people and get away with it with a slap on the wrist. So he gave us a choice: either she goes to prison or she dies. And I said, screw it, she dies, because I wanted the story to end, and I wanted to end on a powerful note, and that was it. And thank goodness we were in an age when there was no internet. And no, the point, if it had been now, word would have leaked out and everyone would have been arguing about it when the book came out. Whereas this way, the book came out and then people started arguing about it and no one believed it. They figured we'd bring her back next issue or 2 issues down the line. And as we went past the funeral and into the next arc, and she stayed dead, they thought, oh my God, they really mean it.
Yeah. So
and that's why I was. Well, it was also why I felt that X Factor was a fundamental mistake.
Yeah.
But
when they revived Jean, and it was only a few years later. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was as far as I recall, bringing Jean back was Byrne's idea, right?
Yes, not just John, but a collaboration of 4 or 5 writers and friends who felt that killing one. I mean, part of the reason for the story's impact was that Jean was half of the second oldest romantic relationship in Marvel. It was Reed and Sue and Scott and Jean. But you don't kill off a major character. You don't suddenly kill off Lois Lane and then make it stick.
Yeah.
I think that would be great, but that's my problem.
No, but it was extremely powerful. I mean, it was something new in superhero comics that somebody that popular.
And it's never been done since, and it will never be done since. But see, that was also my counterpoint to X Factor was leaving aside the fact that in order to restore the Scott-Jean relationship, you had to make Scott an adulterer.
Yeah.
Which, from my perspective, destroyed him for me to an extent that he'll never recover from.
Yeah,
I mean,
you'd introduce Madeline probably, I assume, prior to this thing happening, right? I mean, you had
her resurrection? God, yes.
Yeah, prior to the resurrection.
They were married. They had a kid. That means they were.
Yeah.
In real terms, the relationship goes back 2.5, 3 years. No, the whole point of Madeline was a tease. She looks like Jean, therefore Scott has to be tormented by, oh my God, is this the resurrection of Jean Grey? No, idiot. It's the writer saying, okay, you little twerp, this is where you actually come to the moment where you say, is Jean dead or is she not? Do I really love this woman or should I walk away? And the whole point of it was to have Scott fall in love with her and her fall in love with him, and him finally put Jean to bed. End of story. He has a wife, he has a son, he has a life. He can move on happily ever after. And my counterpoint to X Factor was, if you want to bring back the original team, if you want to bring back Scott, I have no problem with that. Just have his wife and child come with him. He's been re-upped for another tour of duty. Everybody in America would understand that in the post-Vietnam, post-Iraq, you name it. Yeah. This is something we all know, one way or the other. Bring in, if you want a Jean-related character, you bring in her big sister, who can be the living cerebro of the team. If you want to bring back a Jean, I have no problem with that. Bring in a Jean from another dimension who comes into this team of X Factor. She's got a passionate teenage, quote unquote, love for Scott. But this isn't that Scott. This is a grown-up. This is someone who's in his late 20s with a kid and a wife. Yeah. We have a teenage Jean Grey who has to start over again. And in effect, have her be the rogue, not the rogue, for God's sakes, Rachel of this series.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of ways around it, but what the problem was, Jim had given his word to Byrne and the others that they were going to resurrect Jean. And the irony is, the guy who was writing X Factor at the time, the first 3 issues, the first issue didn't even have Scott mention Rachel. I mean, mention
Madeline.
Thank you. I mean, maybe he said goodbye to her and jumped in a plane and went back to New York, but that was the last she ever appeared.
I think so. It's a very memorable panel at the end where she's sitting alone in their house and he's left. I remember as a kid, I was upset about this.
I don't even remember. No, but I mean, the point is, you have him act like a cad. And I mean, maybe with Iron Man you could get away with it, especially once Robert Downey established those dynamics. But no, you couldn't do that. You couldn't have Reed walk out on Sue. That would be disgusting, especially with Franklin in the picture. But again, they are literally not my toys.
No, but like this idea that you had that this was it's a long story, it's an epic story, and they grow up and they grow older, and some may retire and so on. I mean, obviously,
which day are you talking about? The team?
Well, I mean, like Scott, for example. But I imagine maybe some of the other characters too.
Yeah, everybody does. But the thing is,
being a superhero.
Everybody gets older. The point in comics is we never see them get older, because realistically speaking, that's why I always tried to introduce a new, younger character for every decade. So that's where Rogue came in. That's where Gambit came in. So each generation of readers could have a character they could call their own, while Aurora and Nightcrawler, etc., kept going along as the baseline. Yeah. But again, no one ever deals with someone staying on a book for 20 or 30 years. You know, Stan's point was always, as editor-in-chief, when you're done with a book, you take the characters up off the floor, you put them on the shelf the way you found them, so the next writer can start fresh. My problem was I never took them off the floor. I wasn't going to take them off the floor.
No.
And by the time, and in part because of the way I left the X-Men, not of my free will, continuity had evolved to the point where you couldn't reboot the whole X-Men continuity. Perhaps they should have, but they couldn't. And they just kept going.
So, you're one of the very few persons who've been around long enough at Marvel to work both before during and after Jim Shooter as an editor-in-chief. Could you just briefly talk about what were the pros and cons of his era, and what was it like before, and what was it like after Shooter?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a season of joy. It was a season of despair. It depended on what conversation you were having, and it also depended significantly on who your intervening editor was. In my case, for most of it, I had the extreme good fortune to work with Louise Simonson, then Louise Jones, and Ann Nocenti, and they could cope with Jim better than anyone I ever knew. That's the reality. Working with Stan was a whole different dynamic and much more exciting, also much more rational. It's the problem with working. It's always a matter of coping, and it's some people you mesh with, some people you don't. You just have to cope with it as best you can and move on.
Marvel grew bigger during this period and has grown bigger and become more corporate and
that's, I guess, discussion.
I mean, the free for all of the 70s is very different from what
the 70s were different from the early 80s. The early 80s were different from the mid 80s, were different from the late 80s, were different from the 90s. Everything evolves, and the problem with evolution, the challenge with evolution, is it isn't always in the way one thinks it should be, but it's not. It's why if you look at a television series, an American television series that lasts a long time, you'll notice that the star of that series sooner or later ends up as an executive producer. Why? Because that star has a sense of who, since the series is based around that character that actor play or actress plays, they have an inherent sense of what should work and what shouldn't. And they try to express it. And this way they can express it from an aspect of being part of the power structure as opposed to an employee, a purely employee. And comics doesn't have that. I don't know whether it should, but the way it works is, it seems, is that there is a core writer, and as with a writer's room, that writer defines the dynamics of the characters and the stories that encompass this arc, whether it's a dozen issues or a dozen years, and they go from there.
Yeah, and you don't have
that writer goes. It's all for example, the last 4 years of the X canon have been a very specific evolution and presentation of life in a world with Krakoa. Now, with a new editor, managing editor, and a new set of creators, they are rebooting back to the original concept, or an echo of the original concept. What happens next, we'll find out later this year.
It's interesting you're saying. I mean, you obviously found a way to thrive in this system of not owning the characters and having to deal with these compromises when other writers, other editors come in, publishers, and change the direction, and then adapting to that. It's a peculiar set of circumstances to work with. Has creator-owned work ever really appealed to you?
Oh, sure. It's always appealed to me.
Yeah.
The trick is, for example, I've tried to pitch a dozen stories at Angoulême and around Europe. Just haven't found a publisher or artists to work with who were that interested in it. I mean, just because one desires what to do with something, or one has a wish of what to do, doesn't mean, forgive me, I just have realized my computer's about to turn itself off. I just forgot to plug in the
plug it in.
Yep, there we go. You know, wishes are easy, reality is hard or challenging.
Yeah.
And working in comics is also it can spoil one, simply because I know I can turn out a comic story fairly quickly. Novels take a little longer. So, you know, it's short stories take a little longer. I've always found prose much more challenging than comics, simply because I not only have to structure the story, I have to actually write coherently. And
Yeah.
well, I can't blame it on the artist, because I'm
No, I mean, I think that's also one of the virtues of your career is working with such different artists, and it would be great to get into some of them. I just the transition that happens soon after this, I think, is where you really start investigating. Not that you haven't before, but really investigate this basic concept of the X-Men as a minority, a persecuted minority, with Days of Future Past. Obviously, it's at the end, towards the end of the run with Byrne, but it really becomes the theme going forward for the next many years in the X-Men. Yes, I mean, that story. It seems like it keeps generating stories. How did that come together, and what do you see its legacy as being? That story of the time, the two different timelines.
I think the thing is, it just shows that John and I may have been at the end, and we may be yelling at each other a lot, but we hit it out of the ballpark. To use a baseball metaphor, the irony for me is we did in 34 pages what writers today will take 34 issues to do.
Yeah.
You know,
and you actually managed to make a story that was probably or possibly even greater than the Dark Phoenix Saga. It's ridiculous what you.
Well, Dark Phoenix took 11 years. I mean, 11 issues. Yeah. It felt like 11 years. This one we just did.
Yeah.
But it's
was it Harlan Ellis? Was it a Harlan Ellis? That Harlan Ellison story of the soldier that goes back in time.
Yeah, but that wasn't what we were using as any kind of inspiration.
No. It seems to have led to things such as Terminator, which came out later, the film.
Yes, I know.
Very much, to this story, this idea of going back and changing the past, and
I'm not going to ask David.
I'm sure that, James Cameron would have read your stories. No, but what? I'm sure you've had conversations with him.
The only conversation I had with him was when when Stan and I went out to Wildstorm to pitch the X-Men as a movie. And I was sitting there thinking, this will be a chance to work with Catherine Bigelow. Woohoo! All my alpha women characters, and a great, potentially great woman director, and all of this really cool stuff. This is going to be where the X-Men break loose. And then Stan says, I hear you like Spider-Man. And in 30 seconds, the X-Men was gone and forgotten. And Cameron was going to produce, write, and direct Spider-Man. So, sometimes things win, sometimes not so much.
But this introduces the character of Kitty, who I think is for many of us the heart and soul of the X-Men in a way, and the fact that she's Jewish, and you start introducing the Shoah as a motif around this time. So deliberately, I mean, it must have been a difficult line to walk. How deliberately and how emphatically you introduce this real life catastrophe into this fictional universe and make it work without becoming overbearing or seeming cheap. I don't know. Like, did you have any considerations about what did you just go ahead? Like, how did you?
You just did it. I'm sorry. Isn't that what the job is? That's why it says writer.
Sure. The Holocaust is just it's a difficult subject to address in fiction, isn't it?
It's it's how you structure things. It's because it would be like going back to 1923 and saying, this is what's coming. Who would believe you? I mean, really? The Spanish flu had just wiped out 11 million people or more. But if you went back and said that within 20 years, 15 years, one of the most civilized and respected countries in the world was going to establish as an institute, as an aspect of state policy, the extinction of European Jewry. And, along the way, 11 million other people, just to balance the scales. Who would believe you? Seriously. I mean, the thing, it was such an outrageous and such a horrific moment. You sit back and go, no, it's not going to happen. They would not do that. That's horrible. I may not like them all that much, but no. Absolutely not. Mind you, if one were to listen to statements by a current candidate for president on this side of the pond, which sound disconcertingly like quotes from a certain book, you could probably find as many people in the United States going, no, come on. He's just Mein Kampf, really? Come on. You never believe in horror until it actually happens. And even then, as people were being led, they didn't believe it. Why? No, come on. No. You don't always have a country's leader, either practical or titular, being told when all Jews had to wear a Star of David, King was the first one to put one on and say, okay. And managed to get the Nazis to back down a half step. But that's...
It's the myth of... It's the story of the Danish king who... I mean, I don't think it's actually true, but
it's a nice story.
It's a good story.
Yeah. What the hell? Copenhagen's a nice city. We'll figure.
No,
but I mean, this is the thing. You
Danish
can't.
Jews did manage to escape.
I mean, Japanese who were thrown into internment camps in the desert, Mojave Desert, they didn't believe it either. What did we do? We're Americans. No, you're not. You're Japs. Mind you, they then formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and went to Europe and kicked ass. But it's just to prove that they were. But it's it is the thing about the X-Men I discovered as we went along is that how extraordinary readers of various minorities embrace the concept because it spoke to them in language and realities that they dealt with. Whether you're talking about gay readers or Black readers or Hispanic readers or Asian readers, the resonance meant something. And when I'm at conventions and people are talking to me about how much this book meant to them, and they're bursting into tears. And I'm not just talking about here in the United States. In 2019, I did an appearance in Moscow, and I had young Russians coming up and telling me this, and in tears, little realizing on both sides of the table what was waiting in store for everybody, like 2 years later, between COVID and the Ukraine. But the point for me is, if I have in this book and these characters a means to reach out to people, to express realities, I guess, that they can identify with, that have meaning for them, then part of my job as a writer is to do that. An equally, if not more important job as a writer is to make the story worth reading for them at the same time. So they're not just looking at a polemic. And
the balance. I mean, so again, I refer to old interviews with you. There's an interview where you said you think about the Holocaust almost every day, that it's such a major part of, and I think that's felt in the comics over the next 10 years of the X-Men. At the same time, and this is something that I think we also touched upon when we last spoke, this idea of people being able to recognize themselves in them, but also the superhero genre offering maybe an escapist or a fantastic version of that, of something you recognize. It's very glamorous. These are very glamorous characters, while at the same time being persecuted minorities. They're beautiful. They have like larger than life romances. They like that.
I'm sorry.
Like,
have you not ever watched television?
No, I know. But like, what are your thoughts about? Like, no, absolutely. I mean, this is what it offers you. But I'm just
but I mean. We exist.
Is there a difficulty of reconciling the two?
No, I mean, comics exist to make money. The job is to make money. The way we do it is by telling really good stories, which have the readers ideally sitting on the edge of their seat, A, falling in love with the characters, and B, wanting to see what happens next. I mean, the best period of the X-Men's run is when the book comes out on the third Thursday of every month, and a queue starts in front of the comic or beside the comic book store an hour before it opens for people who are desperate to see what the issue is, so they can, oh my God, I've been waiting for 3 weeks. What the hell happens next?
That was me in the 80s. That was me in the 80s.
God bless. But the way you do it is by creating characters that the audience can fall in love with. And the whole point of John's in my last issue is Kitty finding herself alone. Why is she alone? Because it's Christmas and she's not Christian. Everybody else has gone out to go see the tree at Rockefeller Center, to go do this, to go do that. And she's left alone because she's not of that branch.
Yeah.
And obviously no one ever...
It's never stated. It's just there. Which I think is...
And it's not like the previous 10 days they celebrated Hanukkah. Or maybe Hanukkah hasn't happened yet. It'll happen after Christmas, or it's already done yet 6 weeks ago. And then, while she's passing the time, an evil monster pops pops through the ceiling, and she's fighting for her life. In the process, she pretty much destroys a good chunk of the mansion. But she wins. And then she has a happy ending, which is her parents show up and all is well. But then over the next 4 issues, Wolverine and Nightcrawler can't resist the opportunity to poke fun at her because she smashed the whole mansion and they have to put it back together again.
Yeah.
Whereas, and then because she's recovering from what happened, she bursts into tears and runs away. It's trying to balance the hyperbole with a little sense of what it's like to be a person in that situation. She's 13. There are extremes on every level of her life, and hasn't got a clue yet how to deal with it. And that doesn't even begin to bring in the reality that she has superpowers. She's a kid. And it's welcome to the weird world. I mean, as she puts it in a later issue, I've saved the universe twice, and I get, and I've got to, the reality, and I get grounded, they deal with a different reality than everyone else, but they deal with it from a perspective of, with great power comes great responsibility, like it or not. And why do we see so few superpowered characters? Because there's only 18 pages in the book, for crying out loud. We can't fit everybody in here, and we can't have an infinite number of series, and we can't have an infinite number of realities. And the more characters you have, the more unfocused the structure of the reality and of the books become. And it's like when Grant Morrison established that back in the aughts, that there were thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands upon tens of thousands of mutants in the world. To me, this was a dangerous reality. Why? Because it's not, you're not afraid of 100 mutants in a world of 3 billion, now 7 billion people. There's just 100 of them. Even if Magneto all by himself could probably wipe out the world. He's just one obnoxious guy. And as we can find, the Avengers can deal with him. But if there are mutants all over the place, suddenly it's not so much us against them. It's we're losing. We have already lost. We just don't know it yet. That casts this concept and this reality in a whole different order than it was originally. My opposition to when it was decided that the X-Men should go public was, once you cross that threshold, you can never go back. And what makes them cool, for me anyway, as a reader, is that they are clandestine, that they do have something to hide, that there is kind of a sinister but cool aspect of it. It's sinister because people are afraid. It's cool because we're hiding in plain sight. This is what makes Wolverine's challenge to Nightcrawler. If you truly believe that you are a creature of God, walk down the street without the image inducer. See what happens.
Yeah,
and he does.
Yeah.
But no, half the people think he's a guy in costume. Kids love it. Most people don't even notice. Why? Because welcome to the real world. Most people don't notice anything unless it's right in front of them. But that's, once everything is public, it's amazing how quickly they become boring.
But the genie bat in the bottle is difficult. I mean, I guess for Morrison, he brought it to like a genocide situation. But he also
that's a question you'll have to ask Grant. I'm just speaking of it purely as a reader.
Yeah.
And I will confess, anyway, I disagreed with everything, but I couldn't stop reading the book because it was really good. But there you go.
Yeah. And there was a lot of echoes from your run. I mean, he rehashed a lot of. I mean, it was part of his. It seemed like part of his exercise was to go through your stories. And
Well,
do
he's a man of excellent taste, and considerably more ability than subsequent stories, which do grab a hold of my stuff, titles and all. But that's every writer, every editor has their own way of approaching reality. And if it works, bingo. If it doesn't work, well, start again.
You mentioned Magneto. I think that's another. I mean, I don't know how much time we have here, but we're going on. I have many more questions, but Magneto, I think, is such a key. What you do with Magneto in those following issues, starting, I guess, in God Loves Man Kills, which is the X-Men graphic novel, but going on to the New Mutants and of course the X-Men title. Around 200, I think it becomes established. He becomes the leader. Charles takes off. But this transformation of the major villain into a heroic character, conflicted heroic character.
Well, I always thought he was more interesting than Charles.
Why?
He has something to lose. All you can do with Xavier is diminish him. He's already established himself as the ideal hero. A bit of a jackass at times, but basically a hero. Magneto.
Very manipulative.
No, Magneto. With Magneto, he's trying desperately to achieve a heroic goal. The way he's been trying most of his life hasn't worked. He'll try a different path. But why was Charles so cruel as to make him headmaster of a school of kids? Now he has to not simply fight for his goal of saving the world of mutant kind. Now he's got a dozen specific mutants to save, one of whom is a demon, or is 99.9% of a demon. And he has to find a way to keep her on the positive side of the straight and narrow. Except that each time she steps over, he's tempted to step over to bring her back, whereas the rest of the team are desperately holding on to him with all their strength to keep him from stepping over that line, because once he steps over the line shifts, and each time he takes another step, they're all brought crashing along with him. For him, the struggle is more overt and more absolute. And ideally, if it's done right, you're left sitting on the edge of your seat wondering, rooting for him, and yet desperately afraid he'll fail. Whereas with Charles, it's like, what the hell? And my point to Marvel was, I'll happily create as many truly evil villains as you want. Why can't this one be redeemed? And I was overruled.
He did sort of ultimately return to villainy, didn't he?
Yeah.
Even in your run.
No, I killed him off in X-Men 3. Killed in quotes. And the next time you see him, A, I was no longer had anything to do with the book, but B, he had returned to the classic Magneto, which in turn led you to House of M, which in turn led you to yada, 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 yada. But
the conversion happened in the New Mutants, which was, of course, a spin-off title.
Yeah.
And it was during the time when Bill Sienkiewicz was drawing it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very interesting time. And one that seemed to feed your creativity as well. I mean, there's a lot happening in those issues.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a season of love. It was a season of despair.
How was it to work with Bill Sienkiewicz?
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
What was your reaction when you first saw some of the artwork? Because I can remember my head felt like it was exploding when I first saw those pages.
Mine too.
Of number 18.
I wanted to see what happened next.
Yeah.
Always. We knew. I mean, it was like nothing I'd ever seen, and that was wonderful.
But he would also probably bring, I mean, you hear these stories about like notoriously Alan Moore not being able to work with him because, he would not be able to follow, directions and a plot and things like that. He would go off in his own visual experiments and so on.
Alan has his approach to teamwork. I have mine.
Right. But did you feel you have to? I mean, I guess this is one of the. You've worked with so many different kinds of artists, like adapting to them. How did this compare working with like Dave Cockrum or John Byrne? I mean, it must be more free form.
So what?
Yeah.
No, I mean, when Bill and I did the New Mutants special 3 years ago, as we put it, this is the next issue. It just took us 36 years to get here.
Yeah.
But Bill was terrified. I mean, no, he hadn't drawn them in all that time. He didn't know if he could work with me, if he could work with them or anything. By the time he finished the second page, he was off and running. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
But that's it. It's impossible to categorize simply because one adapts to the people one's working with. I mean, how I work with Bill is nothing like how I'd work with Frank. How I'd work with Frank is nothing compared to how I'd work with Walter Simonson. But that's the fun, Same with Alan Davis.
Yeah.
The only thing that made my head explode with Alan was when he came back and took over the book the second time. He wrote his own stuff, and I was so jealous.
Right. That's another one, Frank Miller on Wolverine. That is another collaboration with somebody, of course, who's very much a writer as well. How did that work? I mean, I think you described it as another very sort of breeze when we last talked. In a way that it just developed very quickly.
When you're stuck in a tailback on Interstate 5 in California with the San Onofre nuclear plant on the ocean side of the road and the Marines on the other side, and ICE hunting for illegals in the middle. Nothing else to do. No,
so you were sitting there hashing out the plot.
No, I wasn't so much hashing out the plot. I was trying to establish the baselines to an extent or in a way that Frank would find it interesting. And that's what happened. This is what we wanted to. This is what we both like to do. This is what we didn't want to do. That was it. Frank didn't want to spend 100 pages of Wolverine fighting and killing people. I said that's incredibly boring. I don't want to do that either. So, it became what it became, a love story with surprises. Frank figured he knows who I am, so he left lots of empty space for me to fill with words. And I took one look at the page and thought, this design is brilliant. There's no way in hell I'm going to put words on this page.
Yeah.
But again, he would do a fight scene, which literally read like cinematic storyboards. I didn't there was no need for me to say anything. You just enjoy the visual sweep that carried you along.
And it also made Wolverine a really mature character.
He was always a really mature character.
Well, it's more obviously.
What it made Wolverine was a hero. And a hero to the extent that everyone hopefully realized by the end that he wasn't just a simple cliche, I have claws, I am mean, I will slash and etc. It was that he was a man, and being that, what it all came down to was Shingen Yasuda, Mariko's husband, Marika's father, sorry, forgive me, saying, "You are not a man. You are a monster. You are a beast. You are a thing." And Wolverine believing him and almost getting run over by a bullet train, as Yuriko is like saying, "Hey, so what? We can have fun anyway. You're much more fun as this side of Wolverine than as the Mariko side." And at the end, Wolverine realizing, "No, I am a man. As a man, I will do this. And just don't get in my
It's
way."
also a very, very Frank Miller type story. You know,
is,
See, I would
the
have said it's like Chris
humiliation of
Claremont
the
type of
hero.
story that Frank happened to draw.
Right. It's certainly a subject that he's returned to, the humiliation of the hero who has to rise from, absolute.
Yeah, you mean like I've never returned to that?
Well, no, I'm just saying, like it seemed like that particular collaboration brought that out.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how the collaborations work here and what
Well,
they bring
no,
out.
as I often say, the first issue was a standard plot of mine. It was 20 pages of single space, 20 pages single spaced or space and a half, giving action, dialogue, motivation, the whole 9 yards. The fourth issue was a 20-minute phone call and me taking notes and about a half a page worth of typed notes.
Yeah.
That was it. Because the first issue, I wasn't sure how much he needed to know or of what I was thinking to get my sense of what this was all about. By the fourth issue, it was irrelevant. He knew everything he needed to know. I knew everything I needed to tell him, and that was it. I mean, it would have been fun to see what would happen next, but he was off to Daredevil and then to whatever he was doing at DC at the time, and I was off to the next story.
Yeah. Another collaboration of yours with where the artist seems to have had some kind of influence was your work with Barry Windsor-Smith on the life-death stories and the Uncanny X-Men 205.
Yes.
Could you talk about how that came about?
Accident, and
and who did what?
he drew, I wrote.
Yeah.
I mean, no, the most frustrating thing about that was that he ended up doing the Wolverine origin instead of the third part of the story. And I mean, because it was a 3-part story, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we never did the end because he got caught up in doing other things. And so all of the stuff that was going to be in the end, he did as a creator-owned story for himself. And I ended up integrating into a lot of the work that John Jr. did on Uncanny.
Yeah.
Which is annoying because it would have been nice to get it all in one place together. But, welcome to life.
This is one of the other key characters. It's Aurora Storm, the very radical transformation or development that she undergoes. And this is, I guess, you'd already introduced that with Paul Smith and then...
Well, but see, I think the thing, well, definitely with Smitty, yeah. I mean, it's like...
When she cuts her hair or gets rid of her plants.
Oh, no. That's not the moment. No. The moment is when she kills Callisto.
Right.
Right.
Yes, of course.
Or almost kills Callisto.
Yeah.
And does it in 2 pages, I mean, without even a second thought. And their reaction is, "We didn't know you could do this." Neither did she. But that's the point.
Yeah.
The point I'm making all the way along this with Gene, with Scott, with Gene, with Ro, is none of these are single level people. They all have aspects that are hidden. They are aspects they do not like to be confronted with. They are aspects that if they are pushed to that level will have an appropriate reaction. In Aurora's case, if you put her in a position where she needs to kill, she will kill you. That's why she and Logan understand one another. He's just a lot easier. He finds it a lot easier to get to that point than she does. But she will do it. And the point of stripping her of her powers for a few years is because the powers become a crutch.
I saw Storm. I mean, if to return to Storm and losing her powers, it was, in a way, I mean, it's not stated as such, but it's psychosomatic. I mean, it's part of her working through her identity. I mean, that's not what you were thinking. I mean, what did it do to? I mean, that development is quite remarkable. It's the most drastic development, I think, of any of the characters. Mm-hmm. The one that goes through. And how would you have ended it in the third part? Was it very much like Barry Smith?
Oh no, it would have. No, it would have evolved to the end that I evolved to. The whole point of that was that the not the beyond, whoever the villain was, would have grabbed her and what's his face? Forge. And bounced them to their own world. No, that was the story, but there needed one more point to get her to that point where she realized, in effect, the story I was telling was the story where she walks around the world in the final chapter of
Life Death.
No, not Life Death. The final chapter of Life Death would have been the setup for when Forge and she are sent to this. They're the only living creatures, human creatures on this earth. They are the Adam and Eve of humanity.
Okay.
This is in anyway. And this is where Forge gives her powers back. But the whole idea is for her to learn what it's like to be everyone else. The point is that she loses everything that makes her superpowered, whereas Rogue has superpowers pouring out of her cells, because she's absorbing all these powers. She has to give them back, but the memory is still there. And who knows, if her power goes crazy, she manifests them all simultaneously, which I did a couple of 3 times. That having the abilities isn't a get out of jail free card. That there has to be a consequence. There has to be a downside. Otherwise, what?
Is it understanding humility? I mean, is it?
It's not simply humility. It's just simply how can you cope with it? How do you? It's like becoming, God help me, a brilliant golfer. It's how do you hit the ball in just the right place at just the right time so that you can pop it into this little hole? How do you not get punched in a fight?
So what you said is that you worked a lot of what you intended for Storm into the run you did with
Mm-hmm.
Rita. And just briefly maybe say something about the John Rita run is also remarkable. These are all remarkable runs. I mean, so it's hard for us to contain ourselves here, but he brought a really sense of design to the book, I found, and some very memorable moments as well. What was he like? What was that like compared to
It's great.
Others?
I mean, I actually have it's ridiculous as it sounds, I have no complaints about any of the artists I work with. They all, they may have wanted to throttle me from more often than not, but that's a whole different thing. But
you see really grow on that book. Doing X-Men, he found this graphic style that became such.
Yeah, I mean, the only frustration I have with Smitty was that, as soon as he got his first quote unquote royalty check, he was gone, which was frustrating. He'd never, I wish if he'd stayed on for another full year, I like to think we'd have owned the industry, metaphorically,
Mm.
simply because the sales were just going up exponentially. And the way he presented stories and characters was so rich. I mean, if we could have gotten him, if we could have gotten through the wedding and done the honeymoon, definitely. It would have been really interesting to see where and how the book would have evolved. But
if Paul Smith had stayed on the book rather than
well, not even forever, just for a little longer, so we could see how well it would have interacted, how much richer the interaction would have been with the audience. But I suspect that's how every writer artist team might feel. I mean, I could say the same about John. I could definitely say the same about Dave. The wonderful thing about Dave was that after John's departure and a couple of fill-ins, Dave came back. So we ended up with the first 50 plus issues of the X-Men with me, Dave, and John. And that was it. And that was wonderful because it was a way of presenting the core characters from a remarkably consistent perspective.
And
visual.
And Ramita then takes us through to, I mean, you said that in a way, it's one big story, your X-Men.
No, it is one big story. 94 to, well, actually more practically speaking, it would be 97 through
279.
279, page 11.
What happened there?
Fabian took over.
Right. Okay. And in between that, I mean, so I don't know whether we should just mention, like the this one, because that ties into what you're doing right now. Issue 268. Yes. The standalone issue with where we flash back to the Second World War as part of the story, where Wolverine and Captain America meet each other.
Together again for the first time.
Yep. But also it's where Wolverine and Natasha meet.
Yeah.
For the first time.
Yeah. I mean, you're finding new dimensions here without ever telling us Wolverine's origin story, which I guess is part of like the great appeal of that character, was that there's mystery around him.
Well, from my perspective, Wolverine's origin is none of your damn business.
Yeah.
But that's clearly, other stories, other people, other ideas.
It was an unfortunate decision, but I guess inevitable that somebody would.
It is or it is not. I mean, it's as I said before a while ago, they're not our characters. They are Marvel's characters. As Marvel's characters, that Marvel's can do what they want with them. And anything that I do, regardless of how good, bad, and different it is, can be undone, evolved, commented on by a subsequent writer. As a writer with an ego, that can make my head explode, but it's not like I didn't know what I was getting into when I signed the contract. And from my perspective, my responsibility is to tell the best stories I can. And if that works, great. If it doesn't work, well, try again with either, as Archie Goodwin was fond of saying, if you screw up, you have 30 days to fix it. Yeah. There you go. That's the reality.
So your like the way that your original run on the X-Men ended was a bit abrupt and against your will, as you say.
Yes.
Did you have some kind of endpoint in mind, or would you have happily kept going and found your way to?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah.
I mean, since you're saying it is in a way for you one large story, did you have some kind of resolution in mind? Something that?
No, I figured I'd give it a good 20 years and see what happens, and maybe 25. What the hell? We could do 30 and get into the 21st century officially.
Right.
Well, again, it's playing with reality. Kitty becomes the 50th and last president of the United States. Why? Because she's overthrown by the Sentinels just before the end of her second administration. Oh, which leads us into Days of Future Past. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Which leads into the throwaway line in Days of Future Past, where Rachel confesses that she's always loved Kitty. Oops, except that in the Days of Future Past, Kitty is like old enough to be her mother and maybe her grandmother. Except she comes to our world where Kitty's the same age as she is.
Yeah.
Oops.
Yeah, no, many potential stories. I mean, so in order maybe to bring this up to today, I mean, you've had for the past 20 years occasionally returned to the X-Men and have had your own with Extreme X-Men and onwards, your own sort of alternate timeline for the X-Men. And I guess this is what you're also doing for your new book, which picks up on X-Men
Yes.
268, Uncanny 268, Madripoor Nights.
Yes.
Can you say something about having this space to yourself?
I think it's Marvel's way of giving me something to do that doesn't step on anybody else's toes. Which, quite frankly, is, if that's the way they want it, it's fine by me. I can come up with as many stories as they need. And hopefully, Madripoor Nights with a K will be a really good story. I actually want readers to queue up in front of the comic book store on the third Thursday of every month, wanting to find out what happens next. That's the point. That's what matters. The important thing is to tell a great story here and now. And if it isn't, well, I've just wasted a year. But no, but that's the brutal reality. We're not necessarily judged on what we did. We're judged on what we do in the hopes that it will enable us to have a decent shot with what we are about to embark on.
Sure. Great. Yeah. I think we should wrap here.
Before we get really political.
Yeah. No, but seriously, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, and we will. I mean, there's so much material. I mean, there are also many more things we could have brought up, but I think we've covered a lot of the things that we are really excited about in the X-Men, and hopefully it's been useful to you as well to talk about some of these things like for the 100th time or the 1000th time.
Just as a way of writing it off, what question would you love to ask if we'd had the time?
Who is Nightcrawler's father?
Mystique.
Yeah. Okay.
His husband. Destiny's his mother.
All right.
Right.
And his sister is Rogue.
Ooh.
Sort of.
Rogue takes after his mother, and he takes after Destiny, after Mystique.
Mystique, yeah.
See, the real question is, who are Wolverine's parents?
Yeah,
but that's better left in the clouds, isn't it?
No, I know totally who they are.
Oh, okay.
I always wrote him that way too.
Let's hear it.
Sabretooth is his father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And Seraph, the woman of small stature who runs the Princess Bar in Madripoor, is his mother.
Oh.
Okay.
You never heard
Okay.
that story? This is okay.
No,
This will be the good one to close with.
The Sabretooth thing, yes. The other one, that's a curveball.
Okay.
Great. That's great.
So Seraph is an angel, and she's sent to Earth by supreme authority to do something necessary. So Sabes gets a look at her one after. Well, ain't never seen one of them before, and let's have some fun. And so they have some fun. They go out on a date. Things happen, and Sarah finds out she's pregnant. And highest authority, being beneficent, says, oh, okay, I understand it's Earth. These things happen. You can have the baby, but once that's taken care of, put it up for, find a good family for it, hand it over, and get back up here where you belong. And then Wolverine pops out, and she said, no, my kid, my responsibility, I'm going to raise him. And I said, well, okay, you're stuck. So she's on Earth.
Okay.
So she has to earn a living. So she establishes a bar in Madripoor, and Logan is raised there. Well, sort of bounces between there and Canada. Actually, he's raised there, and then when he's an adolescent, he gets a sense of rebellion and heads off for Canada.
So
And-
when is this? What is this in the late 19th century, or is it in the early 20th, or is that irrelevant?
No, the reason why Sabretooth comes and kills him every year on his birthday, in my arcs, is that because that's why Wolverine, half of the Wolverine takes after his father, Sabretooth. Logan takes after his mother.
Mm.
And that's why he fell in love with Japan, because it is a totally structured, honorable society. And the reason, Sabretooth kills him, because it's not like he's going to kill him. And it's not like if Wolverine fights back, he's going to kill Sabretooth. They both heal. He just wants Wolverine to be like him. I'm your father. Treat me like that. And Wolverine's attitude is no, because Wolverine deep down inside is still 17 years old and a pissant. And it's like, no, if you want me to do something, screw you. I'm not going to kill you. That's what you want. If Sabretooth had said, we're going to go to a cotillion and dance, then he'd probably kill him. But no, it was all very centered. And then at some point, it would all resolve, or it all wouldn't resolve. But at the end of time, there would be Wolverine and Phoenix, and of course, Kitty. And why Kitty? Because one night at the Princess Bar, when the Bells of Hell, Belles of Hell, when Kitty was tidying up, every night she's there, and there's this figure in the shadows keeps saying, I got a job. You want a job? No, I got a job. I'm working, No. I mean a real job. No, I got a real job. I'm cleaning the bar, and I'm also in school. No, and finally she says, okay, what fraternity are you from? And the figure won't say. And so finally she says, okay, clearly this is a joke. Yes, I'll take the job. Not realizing the job is guardian of forever. And when highest authority gives you a job like that, you end up stuck with it. So she's the guardian of forever, and she's now on her third or fourth time around the ring. And it ends with Logan and Phoenix having their moment of passion. And out of that moment of passion comes the next iteration of reality. And around and around we go. And Kitty's job is to keep the omniverse from going crazy.
Yeah.
So we are ultimately dealing with gods here.
What?
We are ultimately dealing with gods, in a way.
No, there is only one highest authority.
Right.
But one is not being specific because it's none of our damn business.
Oh.
These are the next step down. And, where the Asgardians at all fit in is up to you. From my perspective, it's all derived from the Powell Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death, which I think is the best exposition of how to define what happens after death there is. But that's just me.
Yeah. I haven't seen that for many years.
Well, it's the best line ever. Yeah. It's like, when the angel comes to earth, he looks around and, one is so starved for technicolor up there. Because on earth, everything's in technicolor because there are grades of color, whereas in the afterlife, it's black and white because everything there is in black and white. If you go up, it's one emphasis. If you go down, it's another emphasis. But it's always black and white and shades of gray. And on that note,
that's great. Thank you so much.
I'm glad you like it. Let me know how this ends up, where this ends up, or what the heck we've just been doing for the last 2 hours.
Ja, vi kom vidt omkring de sidste par timer i selskab med Claremont, Matthias Wivel og Henry Sørensen. Hvis du har fået lyst til at høre mere X-Men og Radio Rackham, ja, så har vi faktisk tidligere lavet en episode om forfatteren Jonathan Hickmans take på serien House of X, Powers of 10. Den kan du finde på SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcast eller Podimo, hvor vi også har en guldgruppe af godt tegneserierelateret indhold, hvis vi selv skal sige det. Og husk, at du også kan følge os på Instagram, Facebook og YouTube. Tak fordi du kiggede med.